Professor Klaxon adjusted his ceremonial teaching tentacles and gazed down at his xenobiology class with the sort of condescending smugness that only comes from having 3 PhDs and 0 real-world experience. His purple skin glistened under the lecture hall's artificial suns as he cleared his throat with a sound like a garbage disposal having an existential crisis. "Students," he began, his voice dripping with academic superiority. "Today marks your final project for advanced toxicology and primitive species analysis. You will be studying the most dangerous substances known to sentient life." In the front row, Zephyr's 6 eyes widened in perfect synchronization. The blue-scaled Nervanite was already reaching for his emergency anxiety inhaler, because of course he was. Next to him, Blix the Circassian rolled all 4 of her eyes in a pattern that roughly translated to "Here we go again." Her green skin had already shifted to that particular shade that meant she was about to say something that would get her detention. "Professor," Quantum interjected from the back, his crystalline form refracting light in annoyingly precise patterns, "are we discussing molecular toxicity or psychological warfare substances? Because technically speaking, my homeworld's elevator music could be classified as both." Klaxon's tentacles twitched with irritation. "Neither, you geometric nuisance. We're talking about actual chemical compounds that can terminate biological functions. Poison, death juice, the stuff that makes organic beings stop being organic and start being, well, not." He activated the holographic display with a flourish that definitely took him 3 hours to practice in front of his mirror. "Your assignment is simple, even for minds as underdeveloped as yours. Pick a primitive planet, catalog its deadliest natural toxins, and present your findings. Think of it as a survival guide for the rest of civilized society." Zephyr's breathing apparatus was already working overtime. "But Professor, what if we accidentally expose ourselves to these substances during research? What if we die? What if we die horribly? What if we die horribly, and then get bad grades posthumously? That's what remote observation is for, you neurotic fish stick," Blix muttered, earning herself a warning glare from Klaxon. The professor continued, as if his students weren't having various forms of mental breakdowns. "I've taken the liberty of pre-selecting your subjects. Team Zeta, you'll be studying the 3rd planet in the Sol system. Earth, I believe the locals call it. Primitive bipeds, probably haven't even figured out faster than light travel yet." Quantum's form shifted to a more contemplative geometric pattern. "Earth, isn't that the planet with those strange carbon-based life forms that somehow survived their own industrial revolution? The very same, humans, they call themselves. Barely evolved past hitting things with sticks, really. Should be a simple enough subject for your first major research project." Blix leaned back in her hover chair with the kind of grin that made professors regret their career choices. "Oh, this is going to be fun. I bet these humans are so primitive they probably poison themselves accidentally all the time." If only she knew how right she was, and how terrifyingly wrong. 3 Galactic Standard days later, Team Zeta had set up their research station in the university's xenobiology lab, which looked exactly like what you'd expect from a species that thought chrome and floating holographic displays were the height of interior design. Zephyr had already organized their equipment with the kind of obsessive precision that would make a Swiss clockmaker weep with envy. "All right, team," Zephyr announced, consulting his 17 different color-coded research protocols, "I've established a preliminary scan of Earth's biosphere. We should start with the obvious toxic compounds and work our way down to the more obscure ones." Quantum's crystalline form hummed with computational satisfaction. "Logical approach. I've already begun analyzing the molecular structures of Earth's most dangerous substances." His display flickered to life, showing a compound that looked like it was designed by a sadistic chemistry professor. "This is 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine. Lethal dose calculations indicate that approximately 10 grams could terminate most carbon-based life forms." Blix glanced at the readout and snorted. "Fancy name for something that probably grows in some dank cave somewhere. What do the humans call it?" "Caffeine," Quantum replied with the kind of tone reserved for announcing planetary extinctions. The silence that followed was the kind you usually hear right before someone realizes they've made a terrible mistake. "Caffeine," Zephyr repeated slowly, his anxiety levels climbing to new and previously unexplored heights. "That sounds ominous, like something you'd name a torture device." "Oh, it gets better," Quantum continued, clearly enjoying his role as harbinger of doom. "This next compound is capsaicin. It literally triggers pain receptors in mammalian nervous systems. The Scoville scale measures its potency, and some variants can reach over 2 million units." Blix was starting to look genuinely concerned, which was like seeing a black hole express feelings of inadequacy. 2 million units of what? Pain. Are we talking about a weapon here? "Chemical warfare most likely," Zephyr whispered, reaching for his inhaler again. Professor Klaxon was right. These humans live on a death world. No wonder they're so primitive. They're probably too busy avoiding toxic plants to develop proper civilization. Quantum's next revelation hit like a meteor made of pure academic horror. And then there's the Brahmin. Toxic to most Earth mammals. Could cause cardiac arrhythmia, seizures and death in sufficient quantities. Theobromine, Blix pronounced carefully. Sounds like something you'd use to eliminate your annoying relatives. The humans call it chocolate. Another silence. This one lasted long enough for several nearby solar systems to complete their rotations. Chocolate, Zephyr repeated, his voice climbing several octaves. They named their toxin after what does chocolate even mean? Is it an acronym? Chemical Hazard Operations Central or Late Stage Toxin Emergency. Then there's ethanol. Quantum pressed on, apparently unaware that his teammates were having existential crises. Central nervous system depressant. Causes liver damage, brain damage, and at sufficient concentrations complete respiratory failure. Blix had gone from green to a sort of grayish purple that didn't exist in most species' color palettes. Please tell me the humans have the sense to avoid this stuff. Actually, Quantum said, consulting his data with the enthusiasm of someone who'd just discovered fire, I'm detecting massive industrial production facilities dedicated to manufacturing these compounds. Thousands of them. On every continent. Zephyr's breathing apparatus was now working at maximum capacity. They're weaponizing their own planet. This is worse than the destructor wars of the Gamma Quadrant. At least those were honest about trying to kill everyone. Wait, it gets worse. Oh, nervous one, Blix said, studying her own research terminal. I'm reading about something called nicotine. Apparently it's an alkaloid that acts as a neurotoxin. And humans, oh, this can't be right. What? Zephyr and Quantum asked in unison. According to this data, humans deliberately ignite dried plant matter containing this toxin and then inhale the smoke. On purpose. For fun. The lab fell silent, except for the sound of Zephyr's impending nervous breakdown and Quantum's processors struggling to compute the sheer impossibility of what they were discovering. These humans, Quantum said slowly, are either the most suicidal species in the galaxy, or what? Blix demanded. Or we're missing something really, really important. It was Blix who suggested they switch from molecular analysis to direct observation. Mostly because watching Zephyr hyperventilate was getting old. And Quantum's constant recalculations were making a sound like a printer having a seizure. Look, Crystal Boy, she said, jabbing a claw at the observation console. Instead of just staring at chemical formulas all day, why don't we actually watch these humans in their natural habitat? Maybe we'll see how they manage to survive on a planet that's apparently trying to murder them every 5 minutes. Excellent idea, Quantum agreed, his form shifting to what passed for enthusiasm in his species. Live observation should provide context for their survival strategies. Zephyr looked up from his breathing exercises with the expression of someone who'd just been invited to watch a horror movie marathon. Are we sure this is safe? What if we witness mass casualties? What if we see humans accidentally poisoning themselves? What if we see humans intentionally poisoning themselves? What if you shut up and help us calibrate the long-range sensors? Blix interrupted with the kind of patience that suggested her patients had died several light years ago. They focused their observation array on a major human population center. The first thing they saw was a building with large transparent panels and what appeared to be a queue of humans extending around the block. Fascinating, Quantum observed. The humans appear to be lining up for something. Perhaps it's a medical facility, a decontamination center. Blix zoomed in on the signage. It says, Starbucks. What's a Starbucks? Is that some kind of emergency treatment facility? Wait, Zephyr said, his voice rising to frequencies that could shatter glass. Look at what they're carrying when they leave. The aliens watched in growing horror as human after human emerged from the building carrying containers of dark liquid, which they then proceeded to drink. Voluntarily, with apparent enjoyment. No, Quantum whispered, his crystalline structure flickering with disbelief. No, that cannot be what I think it is. Run a spectral analysis on that liquid, Blix demanded, though her voice had lost its usual sarcastic edge and now carried the tone of someone watching a slow-motion disaster. Quantum's processors whirred for several seconds before delivering the verdict that would haunt their dreams for cycles to come. It's caffeine. Concentrated caffeine. They're consuming it in quantities that should render them unconscious within minutes. But they're not unconscious, Zephyr pointed out, his voice reaching pitches that could summon emergency medical services. They're walking around. They're talking. That human just smiled while drinking what should be a lethal dose of neurotoxin. Blix switched to another location, hoping against hope that they'd stumbled upon some kind of bizarre human medical treatment. Instead, they found themselves observing what appeared to be a festival. Humans were gathered around small booths, purchasing items that made their observation equipment register immediate hazard warnings. Those appear to be concentrated capsaicin delivery systems. Quantum reported with the mechanical precision of someone whose worldview was systematically being demolished. Ghost peppers. Carolina Reapers. Some of these register over 2 million Scoville units. And the humans are. Zephyr couldn't finish the sentence. Eating them, Blix completed, her voice hollow. They're eating them and laughing. That one just asked for extra spice. The final nail in their collective sanity came when they observed a human social gathering. Groups of humans sat around tables, consuming liquid that their sensors identified as ethanol in concentrations that should have resulted in immediate liver failure. Not only were they consuming it, they appeared to be celebrating while doing so. This is impossible, Quantum stated with the kind of certainty that immediately precedes being proven completely wrong. My calculations indicate that a single serving of what they call beer should render most carbon-based lifeforms comatose. Yet they're consuming multiple servings and becoming more animated. Look at that one, Zephyr whispered, pointing at a human who was simultaneously consuming ethanol, inhaling nicotine smoke, and eating what appeared to be chocolate. He's consuming 3 different toxins at once and he's not even showing signs of distress. He's laughing. Blix observed with the tone of someone observing the heat death of the universe. He's poisoning himself with multiple lethal compounds and he's enjoying it. The 3 alien students stared at their monitors in silence, watching humans casually consume what should have been a pharmacy's worth of deadly substances. Children were eating chocolate. Adults were gathering specifically to consume alcohol. Entire restaurants were dedicated to serving food laced with capsaicin. I need to contact Professor Klaxon immediately, Zephyr announced, his panic levels reaching orbital velocities. This isn't a primitive species, this is something else entirely. But Quantum was still processing data, his form flickering with the kind of computational overload that usually required professional repair services. According to my analysis, these humans aren't just surviving exposure to these toxins, they're actively seeking them out. They're paying for them. They've built entire industries around mass producing and distributing them. They've weaponized their own food supply, Blix said quietly, and they're winning a war against biochemistry itself. The emergency faculty meeting was called within the hour. Professor Klaxon arrived with his usual pompous swagger, took one look at their data, and promptly requested a very strong drink, which, given what they'd just learned about humans, was probably ironic in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. This is preposterous, Klaxon declared, his tentacles writhing in academic denial. Primitive species don't develop immunity to multiple toxins. It's scientifically impossible. Professor, Zephyr ventured carefully. What if they're not primitive? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, which, considering what they'd learned about humans, was probably something humans would find delicious. Professor Klaxon's response to the suggestion that humans might not be primitive was to laugh until his breathing gills turned purple. Nonsense. Utter academic rubbish. These bipedal mammals haven't even achieved galactic travel. They're probably still using combustion engines and believing their planet is the center of the universe. But Professor, Quantum interjected, his crystalline form pulsing with what could charitably be called determination, the data suggests otherwise. Perhaps we should conduct a more comprehensive cultural analysis. Fine, Klaxon huffed, clearly expecting his students to prove themselves wrong. Waste your time. But when you come crawling back with tales of primitive toxin avoidance behaviors, don't expect any academic mercy. So Team Zeta dove deeper into their research, and what they found made their previous discoveries look like a relaxing vacation to a peaceful meadow planet. The first revelation came when Blix discovered something called energy drinks. Okay team, she announced with the tone of someone who just found evidence of cosmic horror. I thought the coffee thing was bad. But humans have apparently decided that regular caffeine wasn't potent enough, so they've created what they call energy drinks. Define potent, Zephyr requested, though his voice suggested he really didn't want to know. Some of these contain over 300 milligrams of caffeine per serving, plus something called taurine, which my database lists as a compound that can cause cardiac irregularities. Plus sugar levels that should induce immediate diabetic coma. Quantum ran the calculations with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new form of mathematics. That's enough stimulants to keep a Regellian battle cruiser crew awake for a full cycle. Consuming that should result in heart failure within minutes. And yet, Blix continued, pulling up surveillance footage that would haunt their dreams for eons. Humans consume these beverages specifically when they need to stay awake longer. College students drink them while studying, workers drink them during long shifts. Some humans consume multiple cans per day. The footage showed a human college student downing what appeared to be 3 energy drinks in succession, then proceeding to work on something called calculus for 14 straight hours without showing any signs of toxicity. In fact, the human appeared more alert and focused than before. This defies every known principle of biochemistry. Quantum stated with the kind of certainty that was about to be violently murdered by reality. By all calculations, that human should be experiencing severe tachycardia, nervous system overload, and probable cardiac arrest. Instead, he just solved 37 mathematical equations and started on his philosophy homework. Blix observed with a tone that suggested she was questioning the fundamental nature of existence itself. But the energy drinks were just the beginning. Zephyr, in his obsessive research methodology, had uncovered something that made everyone's previous horror pale in comparison. "Team," he announced, his voice shaking like a leaf in a cosmic storm, "I've discovered something called competitive eating. Humans gather specifically to consume dangerous substances in quantities that should be physically impossible." "Elaborate," Quantum demanded, though his optical sensors were already dimming in preparation for psychological trauma. "There are humans who consume over 50 hot dogs in 10 minutes. Others who eat dozens of these ghost peppers we identified earlier, not for survival, but for sport. There's an entire competitive circuit dedicated to consuming increasingly dangerous combinations of capsaicin-laced foods." The aliens watched in growing existential terror, as footage showed humans deliberately subjecting themselves to what any reasonable species would classify as chemical warfare. One human consumed a sandwich containing peppers that registered over 3 million Scoville units. Not only did he survive, he asked for seconds and complained that it wasn't spicy enough. "They're treating biochemical weapons like recreational activities," Blix whispered, her sarcasm completely overwhelmed by pure undiluted awe. "But wait," Zephyr continued, because apparently their sanity hadn't been thoroughly demolished yet. "There's more. I've discovered alcohol consumption rituals that defy all known limits of organic tolerance." The surveillance footage that followed would later be classified by Galactic University as an existential hazard requiring therapeutic intervention for viewers. Humans were participating in something called beer pong, consuming quantities of ethanol that should have resulted in immediate coma, while simultaneously demonstrating improved coordination and social bonding. "That human just consumed what my calculations indicate is 12 times the lethal dose of ethanol for most carbon-based life forms," Quantum reported with the mechanical precision of someone whose logical processors were systematically shutting down. "He's not dying. He's singing. And dancing," Blix added helplessly. "He's dancing to music that, according to my audio analysis, contains frequencies that should be mildly annoying to most species, but apparently humans find it enjoyable." The final nail in their collective understanding of reality came when they discovered wine tasting. Humans were gathering specifically to consume ethanol in its purest forms, discussing its flavors and characteristics like it was some kind of sophisticated cultural practice rather than systematic self-poisoning. "They have an entire vocabulary dedicated to describing different types of toxin," Zephyr reported, his voice reaching frequencies that could summon interdimensional beings. "Full-bodied, fruity notes, complex finish. They're treating ethanol consumption like an art form. Some of these wines are hundreds of years old," Quantum added, his form flickering with computational overload. "Humans are aging their toxins like fine weapons and paying increasingly large amounts of currency for older, more potent versions." "And chocolate," Blix said, consulting her research with the expression of someone watching the universe fold in on itself. "They've created an entire holiday dedicated to giving each other concentrated theobromine. Children receive massive quantities of what should be lethal doses, and parents encourage this behavior. It's called Valentine's Day," Zephyr added, his anxiety levels reaching escape velocity. "They've weaponized romance." The 3 students sat in silence, staring at their data screens filled with evidence that humans had somehow turned every known biological toxin into a recreational activity. Coffee shops on every corner, bars as social gathering centers, restaurants competing to create the spiciest food possible, chocolate factories producing millions of units of concentrated theobromine for mass distribution. Either we're witnessing the most elaborate species-wide suicide pact in galactic history, Quantum concluded with the kind of logical precision that was completely useless in the face of such overwhelming evidence, or humans represent something entirely outside our understanding of biological limitations. "Professor Klaxon is not going to believe this," Zephyr whispered. "Professor Klaxon is not going to want to believe this," Blix corrected. "There's a difference, and honestly, after what we've discovered, I'm not sure I want to believe it either. But we have to." Quantum stated with crystalline clarity. Because if humans can casually consume substances that should terminate most known life forms, and not only survive but thrive and build entire cultures around it, then we need to fundamentally reconsider everything we think we know about biological limitations. And what that means, Blix said slowly, for any species that might ever find themselves in conflict with humans. The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before someone realizes that the universe has a very twisted sense of humor. It was at this precise moment of existential crisis that Dean Morpheus decided to make his entrance. The Dean was one of those beings whose species was so ancient that nobody really remembered what they were called, and he had the kind of presence that suggested he'd seen the birth and death of several universes and found them mildly entertaining at best. "Gentlemen, lady," he said, nodding to each of them with the kind of calm that immediately made everyone suspicious. "I understand you've been having some difficulty with your Earth research project." Professor Klaxon's tentacles writhed with the academic equivalent of nervous laughter. "Dean Morpheus, these students have clearly made some fundamental error in their methodology. Their data suggests that humans regularly consume lethal toxins for recreational purposes, which is obviously impossible." "Is it?" Dean Morpheus asked with the kind of smile that suggested he knew something everyone else didn't, which, given his position, was probably everything. "Of course it's impossible," Klaxon spluttered. "No species could survive regular exposure to caffeine, ethanol, capsaicin, and theobromine in the quantities these students claim humans consume. The biological mechanisms simply don't exist." Dean Morpheus settled into a chair that materialized out of nowhere, which was the kind of casual reality manipulation that came with tenure at a Galactic University. "Professor Klaxon, in your extensive academic career, have you ever actually visited Earth?" The question hung in the air like a confession waiting to happen. Klaxon's tentacles performed what could charitably be called nervous writhing. "Well, no, but theoretical analysis clearly indicates that direct observation would be unnecessary given the obvious biological limitations of carbon-based life forms." "I see," Dean Morpheus said with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. "And you, my dear students, have been operating under Professor Klaxon's theoretical framework, correct?" Zephyr, Blix, and Quantum exchanged glances that conveyed entire conversations about academic hierarchy, the nature of scientific inquiry, and the growing suspicion that their professor might be what humans would call a complete idiot. "Dean Morpheus," Quantum ventured carefully, "are you suggesting that our observational data is accurate? That humans actually do consume these substances regularly without experiencing toxicity?" "Oh, my crystalline friend," Dean Morpheus chuckled with the kind of warmth that somehow made the situation infinitely more terrifying, "your observational data is not only accurate, it's barely scratching the surface of human dietary resilience." The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when fundamental assumptions about reality are revealed to be adorably naive. "You see," Dean Morpheus continued, settling back in his impossible chair, "I've had the pleasure of visiting Earth on several occasions. Lovely planet. Terrifying inhabitants. The first time I went, I made the same assumptions your professor has made. Carbon-based life forms, relatively young species, probably quite fragile. I packed extensive medical supplies and environmental protection gear." Blix leaned forward with the expression of someone about to witness a traffic accident in slow motion. "What happened?" "Well, my first day there, I was invited to something called a barbecue. Seemed harmless enough. Social gathering, food preparation, standard cultural bonding ritual. So I accepted, thinking it would be an excellent opportunity for anthropological observation." Dean Morpheus paused, and his expression suggested he was reliving something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of the universe. "The humans began by consuming something called beer, which I immediately recognized as ethanol, in concentrations that should have impaired their cognitive functions within minutes. Instead, they became more social and relaxed. Then they started grilling meat over open flames while consuming increasingly potent ethanol mixtures called cocktails." "That doesn't sound too dangerous," Zephyr said hopefully. "Oh, my anxious friend, that was just the beginning. The meat they were preparing was seasoned with enough capsaicin to qualify as a chemical weapon by most galactic standards. They called it barbecue sauce, and they were applying it liberally while laughing and making jokes about how it would, quote, burn their faces off, unquote." Professor Klaxon's tentacles had gone rigid with academic horror. Surely they exhibited signs of toxicity. On the contrary, they exhibited signs of enjoyment. But then came the beverages. One human offered me something called coffee, which I politely declined after scanning it and discovering caffeine concentrations that should have been fatal. The human looked confused and said, and I quote, "But it's decaf." Apparently, they had created a version with reduced toxicity for those who couldn't handle the full strength. "Reduced toxicity," Quantum repeated with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested his logic circuits were actively shorting out. But the real revelation came when dessert was served. They brought out something called chocolate cake. Not only were they consuming concentrated theobromine, they were giving it to their offspring. Small humans were eating quantities of what should have been lethal doses while laughing and asking for more. The dean paused to let this information settle, which it did like a meteor settling into a peaceful countryside. I decided to conduct a more thorough investigation. I visited what they call a coffee shop during their morning rush hour. Hundreds of humans lined up to consume beverages containing caffeine concentrations that would incapacitate most known life forms. Not only were they consuming it, they were paying premium prices for extra strength versions called espresso. "This is insane," Professor Klaxon whispered. "It gets better." Dean Morpheus continued with the enthusiasm of someone sharing particularly good gossip. "I attended something called a wine tasting, where humans gathered specifically to consume ethanol in its purest forms, discussing its characteristics and flavors. They had an entire vocabulary dedicated to describing different types of toxin: full-bodied, complex finish, fruity undertones. They were treating systematic self-poisoning like high art." Blix had gone completely silent, which was roughly equivalent to a supernova deciding to take a nap. Then I discovered competitive eating. Humans gathering specifically to consume dangerous substances in quantities that should be physically impossible. Hot dog eating contests. Spicy pepper challenges. I watched a human consume enough capsaicin to disable a military strike team, and his only complaint was that it wasn't hot enough. "But how?" Zephyr demanded, his voice climbing to frequencies that could summon emergency services. "How do they survive? What's their secret?" Dean Morpheus smiled with the kind of expression that suggested the answer was simultaneously simple and completely terrifying. "Evolution, my dear students. Humans didn't just adapt to survive on their planet, they adapted to thrive on it. Every substance you've identified as a toxin, humans have been consuming for thousands of years. Their bodies have developed not just tolerance but dependence." Dependence, Quantum echoed. "Caffeine withdrawal causes headaches and fatigue. Humans who don't consume their daily dose of what should be lethal neurotoxin actually experience decreased functionality. They've essentially weaponized their own metabolism." Professor Klaxon's academic worldview was dissolving like sugar in acid rain. "But that's impossible. No species could develop such comprehensive toxin resistance," Professor Dean Morpheus said gently. "Humans evolved on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill them. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, predators, diseases, and yes, toxic plants and substances. Most species would have gone extinct. Humans looked at each challenge and said, 'How can we make this work for us?' They didn't just survive their environment," Blix said slowly, understanding dawning in her voice. "They conquered it." "Precisely. And then they decided that conquering their environment wasn't enough, so they started conquering chemistry itself. They turned every biological toxin into a recreational activity. Caffeine became coffee culture. Ethanol became social bonding. Capsaicin became cuisine. Theobromine became celebration. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud that humans would probably find delicious and wonder if it came in different flavors. "Which brings us," Dean Morpheus said with the kind of smile that suggested the best part was yet to come, "to the real question. If humans can casually consume substances that should terminate most known life forms, and build entire civilizations around it, what does that tell us about human biology in general?" The silence that followed was the kind you hear when everyone simultaneously realizes they've been thinking about the problem completely wrong. "They're not fragile," Quantum said slowly. "They're not primitive," Zephyr added, his anxiety transforming into something approaching awe. "They're the opposite of everything we assumed," Blix concluded. "Indeed," Dean Morpheus agreed. "Now class, what do you think happens when a species that treats biochemical weapons as recreational beverages decides it wants to explore the galaxy?" The presentation to the Galactic Academic Council was scheduled for the following week, which gave Team Zeta exactly enough time to question everything they'd ever believed about biology, chemistry, and the fundamental nature of existence itself. The council chamber was packed. Word had spread through the university about the Earth Research Project, and faculty members from 17 different departments had gathered to witness what they assumed would be either groundbreaking research or the most spectacular academic failure in recent memory. The betting pools were running heavily in favor of spectacular failure. Professor Klaxon sat in the front row, his tentacles twitching with what could charitably be called nervous energy and more accurately be described as barely contained academic terror. He'd spent the week trying to find flaws in his students' methodology, but Dean Morpheus had helpfully provided additional verification data that only made everything worse. Zephyr approached the podium with the kind of confidence that comes from having your entire worldview systematically demolished and rebuilt. His anxiety had evolved into something approaching existential acceptance, which was probably the healthiest response to discovering that the universe was far stranger than anyone had imagined. Esteemed colleagues, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, our research into Earth's toxic substances has revealed findings that challenge fundamental assumptions about biological limitations and species classification. A ripple of polite academic interest passed through the audience. Several professors were already preparing their critique notes, because nothing made academics happier than finding flaws in other people's work. We began this project with the assumption that we were studying a primitive species inhabiting a marginally habitable world. Our initial scans identified numerous highly toxic compounds that should have made complex life impossible. Zephyr activated the holographic display, showing molecular structures that made several audience members unconsciously lean back in their seats. Caffeine, a neurotoxin that should cause cardiac arrest in lethal doses. Capsaicin, a compound that triggers intense pain responses. Ethanol, a central nervous system depressant that causes organ failure. Theobromine, a cardiac stimulant toxic to most mammals. Nicotine, an alkaloid that acts as a potent neurotoxin. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was exactly the kind of analysis they'd expected from a student project on primitive worlds. However, Zephyr continued, and his tone suggested that everything everyone thought they knew was about to be thoroughly destroyed. Our observational data revealed something unprecedented in galactic biological studies. The display switched to surveillance footage from Earth. The first image showed a coffee shop during morning rush hour, with hundreds of humans lined up to consume what the audience now knew contained potentially lethal doses of caffeine. Humans do not avoid these toxic substances, Zephyr announced to a chamber that had gone completely silent. They actively seek them out. The footage continued, showing humans consuming energy drinks, participating in spicy food challenges, attending wine tastings, and celebrating holidays centered around chocolate consumption. With each image, the academic audience grew more uncomfortable, shifting in their seats like students who'd just realized they'd studied for the wrong exam. Blix took over the presentation with the kind of sardonic confidence that came from having spent a week watching her professor's fundamental assumptions crumble like cookies in a cosmic blender. Humans have not only developed tolerance to these substances, she announced, they've made them central to their cultural and social structures. Coffee shops serve as community gathering centers. Bars are venues for social bonding. Restaurants compete to create increasingly potent capsaicin concentrations. Chocolate is given as expressions of affection. The display showed a human wedding reception where guests were consuming multiple toxic substances simultaneously while celebrating. The bride and groom were sharing something called wedding cake, which contained concentrated theobromine, while drinking champagne with ethanol concentrations that should have required medical supervision. They've turned biochemical warfare into recreational activities. Blix continued, her voice carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for witnessing the birth of stars. Competitive eating contests feature humans consuming quantities of toxic substances that would hospitalize most known species. Wine tasting events involve humans deliberately consuming ethanol while discussing its flavor profiles like it's sophisticated cuisine rather than systematic self-poisoning. A professor from the Department of Xenobiology raised a trembling appendage. Are you suggesting that humans have somehow evolved immunity to these substances? Quantum's crystalline form pulsed with computational satisfaction as he approached the podium. Not immunity, Professor, adaptation. And not just adaptation but weaponization of their own biological system. The display shifted to show detailed metabolic analyses. Human liver function is specifically adapted to process ethanol. Their nervous systems have developed tolerance to caffeine concentrations that would incapacitate most carbon-based life forms. Their pain receptors actually release endorphins in response to capsaicin exposure, creating a biochemical reward system for consuming what should be a deterrent. They've essentially turned their own bodies into toxin processing factories. Quantum continued with the kind of logical precision that made the implications even more terrifying. But the most significant finding is this: humans who are deprived of these substances experience withdrawal symptoms. They've created biological dependence on compounds that should be lethal. A stunned silence fell over the chamber. Several professors were frantically taking notes, while others appeared to be having quiet existential crises. Furthermore, Quantum pressed on because apparently the audience's collective sanity hadn't been thoroughly demolished yet. Humans have industrialized the production of these substances. Caffeine production facilities exist on every continent. Ethanol manufacturing is a multi-billion credit industry. Capsaicin cultivation has become agricultural specialization. They've created entire economic systems around mass producing and distributing biological toxins. Professor Klaxon, who had been sitting in increasingly horrified silence, finally found his voice. This is impossible. No species could develop such comprehensive resistance to multiple toxic compounds while maintaining complex civilization. And yet, Dean Morpheus said, rising from his seat with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, they have. Which brings us to the most important question raised by this research. The dean approached the podium with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent decades watching academic assumptions crumble. If humans can treat substances that should be lethal as recreational beverages, what does that suggest about human resilience in general? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. It suggests, Dean Morpheus continued, that human biology operates on principles we don't fully understand, that their capacity for adaptation exceeds our current models, that their ability to not just survive but thrive in hostile environments may be unparalleled in known galactic civilizations. A professor from the Department of Galactic Security raised what appeared to be a hand, though with his species it was difficult to tell. Are you suggesting that humans represent a potential threat to galactic stability? I'm suggesting, Dean Morpheus replied with a smile that somehow made the chamber feel several degrees colder, that any species capable of weaponizing their own metabolism probably shouldn't be underestimated, ever. The implications of this statement settled over the chamber like a blanket made of pure concentrated worry. Blix stepped forward for the final presentation element with the kind of grin that suggested she was about to deliver the punchline to a cosmic joke. Based on our research, we recommend that the galactic classification system be updated to include a new category for humans. The display showed their proposed classification: species Homo sapiens classification, Death World survivors threat level, unknown, but probably significant recommended approach. Extreme caution, preferably with caffeinated beverages as peace offerings. Special notes: do not attempt to poison. They consider it a recreational activity. We also recommend, Zephyr added with newfound confidence, that any future diplomatic contact with humans include extensive research into their dietary preferences. Understanding their toxin consumption patterns may be crucial for successful interspecies relations. The presentation concluded to the kind of silence that usually follows revelations about the fundamental nature of reality. Professors sat in stunned contemplation, while Dean Morpheus nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose point had been thoroughly proven. Professor Klaxon remained in his seat, staring at the data displays with the expression of someone whose entire academic career had just been revealed to be based on hilariously incorrect assumptions. His tentacles had gone completely limp, which was roughly equivalent to a complete psychological shutdown. Any questions? Zephyr asked the chamber. The silence stretched for several minutes before a voice from the back called out, "Yeah, I've got one. Are we absolutely sure humans haven't figured out faster than light travel yet?" The question sent a collective shiver through the chamber, because everyone suddenly realized they'd been operating under the assumption that humans were safely contained on their own planet. And given what they'd just learned about human adaptability, the idea of humans with access to galactic civilization was approximately as comforting as a vacation to the center of a black hole. That, Dean Morpheus said with the kind of smile that suggested he knew something everyone else didn't, is an excellent question. Class dismissed. As the chamber emptied, faculty members could be heard making increasingly worried observations about the implications of the research. Several professors were already updating their insurance policies, while others were quietly beginning to research the safest possible distance from the Sol system. And somewhere in the back of everyone's mind was the growing realization that if humans ever did figure out interstellar travel, the galaxy's first and most important diplomatic protocol would probably involve bringing really good coffee. Because if there's one thing worse than meeting a species that treats biochemical weapons as recreational beverages, it's meeting them when they haven't had their morning caffeine.